Chapter 1: Shadows of the Astronomical Clock. Janek pressed himself deeper into the alcove, the damp stone of the building cold against his thin shirt. Rain slicked the cobblestones of Old Town Square, reflecting the gaslights in distorted pools. The crowds, typically thick even late into the evening, had thinned considerably thanks to the downpour. This suited Janek. He needed the cover of darkness and the relative solitude the storm provided. His gaze remained fixed on the Prague astronomical clock, Orloj as the locals called it. Tourists flocked to it every hour, craning their necks to watch the procession of the apostles, the skeletal figure of death tolling his bell, and the vain figure of vanity admiring his reflection. They saw a quaint spectacle, a symbol of Prague's rich history. Janek saw something far more sinister. For weeks, he had been observing the activities around the clock tower. He'd seen robed figures slipping into the tower's entrance late at night, carrying strange tools and chanting in low, guttural tones. He had heard the rhythmic grinding of gears emanating from within, sounds that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. He'd also heard rumors, whispers in the narrow streets about a strange cult that had taken interest in the astronomical clock and was planning something nefarious with it. Janek wasn't sure what they were doing, but he sensed a growing dread within him, a cold knot of fear that tightened with each passing day. He was just a boy, barely 13, an orphan scraping by on the edges of Prague society. He sold newspapers, ran errands, and sometimes, when desperation clawed too deep, picked pockets. But he possessed a keen intelligence and a sharp sense of observation, traits honed by a life lived on the streets. He also had a strong will and a deep-seated hatred for injustice, forged in the fires of his own difficult existence. A figure emerged from the clock tower's arched entrance. It was Father Elijah, the leader of the Clockwork Cult. Janek had recognized him from the hushed descriptions he'd overheard in the taverns, a man with piercing blue eyes, gaunt cheeks, and a voice that could charm birds from the trees or freeze the blood in a man's veins. Father Elijah wore a long, black robe, its hood pulled low to obscure his face. He carried a lantern, its beam cutting through the rain and illuminating his path. He was not alone. Two other figures, their faces hidden by masks crafted from polished brass, flanked him. They moved with a disturbing synchronicity, like clockwork automatons following a pre-programmed sequence. Janek's heart hammered against his ribs. He had to know what they were up to. He edged out of the alcove, keeping to the shadows, and began to follow them. They headed away from Old Town Square, towards the labyrinthine streets of the Jewish quarter. The rain intensified, plastering Janek's hair to his forehead and chilling him to the bone, but he pressed on, his determination fueled by a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. The figures turned into a narrow alleyway, barely wider than a man's shoulders. Janek hesitated. The alley was dark and forbidding, a place where shadows seemed to possess a life of their own. But he couldn't turn back now. He took a deep breath and plunged into the darkness. The alley opened into a small courtyard, enclosed by high brick walls. In the center of the courtyard stood a dilapidated building, its windows boarded up, and its entrance sealed with a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. This was the entrance to the catacombs that burrowed beneath Prague, a forgotten realm of crumbling bones and ancient secrets. Father Elijah produced a key and unlocked the iron bands, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. He pushed open the door, revealing a gaping maw of darkness. The masked figures followed him inside, and the door swung shut with a resounding thud. Janek waited, his breath clouding in the cold air. He couldn't risk following them inside. The cultists would surely be alert. He'd have to find another way in. He circled the courtyard, searching for an opening, a window, anything that could give him access to the catacombs. He spotted it near the top of the wall, a narrow crack in the brickwork, barely large enough for a child to squeeze through. It was a long shot, but it was his only chance. Janek looked around. There was an old wooden crate discarded in a corner of the courtyard. It was rotten and unstable, but it might be enough to give him a boost. He dragged the crate beneath the crack and climbed on top. The wood groaned under his weight, threatening to collapse. He reached for the crack, his fingers scrabbling against the rough brick. He managed to get a grip and pulled himself upwards. The crack was even narrower than he had anticipated. He had to twist and contort his body to squeeze through, scraping his skin against the sharp edges of the brick. He finally managed to wriggle his way through, tumbling into the darkness on the other side. He landed on a pile of loose earth, the musty smell of decay filling his nostrils. He was inside the catacombs. He had no idea where Father Elijah and his followers had gone, but he was determined to find them, to uncover the truth behind their sinister rituals. Janek stood up, brushing the dirt from his clothes. He took a deep breath and stepped into the darkness, ready to face whatever horrors awaited him in the depths of the earth. He could hear faint voices in the distance, and the grinding of gears getting louder. Chapter 2: The Whispers of the Dead. Janek's eyes struggled to adjust to the gloom. The catacombs were a labyrinth of narrow tunnels and crumbling chambers, the air thick with the stench of mildew and decay. The only light came from faint patches of phosphorescence clinging to the walls, casting eerie shadows that danced and shifted with every movement. He pulled a small candle and matches from his pocket, a habit ingrained from years of navigating Prague's dark streets. Striking the match, he held the flickering flame to the candle's wick. A small pool of light pushed back the darkness, revealing the gruesome reality of his surroundings. Skulls and bones lined the walls, stacked haphazardly in macabre displays. In some places, entire skeletons lay sprawled on the floor, their empty eye sockets staring accusingly at the living. Janek tried to ignore the grisly sights, focusing on the task at hand. He had to find Father Elijah and uncover the cult's plan. He followed the sound of voices, his footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. The tunnels twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the heart of the catacombs. He passed through chambers filled with ancient sarcophagi, their lids sealed with strange symbols and worn with time. He spotted tattered remnants of old coffins, some with human remains still inside. As he ventured further, he began to hear whispers, faint voices murmuring in the darkness. At first he thought it was his imagination, the product of fear and fatigue. But the whispers grew louder, more distinct, seeming to emanate from the very walls themselves. "Leave this place. one voice hissed, its tone raspy and malevolent. "You do not belong here." "Turn back," another voice pleaded, its tone filled with despair. "There is only suffering and death ahead." Janek shivered, his hand trembling as he held the candle aloft. He didn't believe in ghosts, but the voices were undeniably real, sending a chill down his spine. He pressed on. The grinding of gears grew louder, drawing him towards a large chamber at the end of a long tunnel. He crept towards the entrance, peering inside. The chamber was circular, its walls lined with shelves filled with strange artifacts. Alchemical equipment, astronomical instruments, and dusty tomes were scattered haphazardly around the room. In the center of the chamber stood a massive clockwork mechanism, a grotesque parody of the astronomical clock above. The golem of gears, he thought. The whispered rumors in taverns came to life. The mechanism was a tangle of gears, cogs, and springs, crafted from brass, iron, and polished wood. It pulsed with an unnatural energy, its gears grinding and whirring in a hypnotic rhythm. A network of wires and tubes snaked across the floor, connecting the mechanism to various points in the chamber. Father Elijah stood before the clockwork device, his arms raised in a gesture of supplication. The masked figures flanked him, their bodies swaying in time with the grinding gears. "O clockwork God," Father Elijah intoned, his voice echoing in the chamber, "we offer you our devotion, our service, our very lives. Grant us the power to control time, to shape reality according to our will." The masked figures chanted in response, their voices rising in a crescendo of religious fervor. They started taking off their masks. Janek could see their faces. Sister Magdalena was there also. Janek recognized them. They were people from the neighborhood, some shop owners, teachers, local priests. Janek watched in horror as Father Elijah approached the clockwork mechanism. He reached out and placed his hand on a large brass gear. The gear began to spin, slowly at first, then faster and faster. A wave of energy pulsed through the chamber, causing the candle in Janek's hand to flicker and nearly extinguish. The air crackled with electricity. The shadows in the chamber deepened, twisting into grotesque shapes. Janek's head throbbed. He began to feel dizzy, disoriented. The whispers intensified, becoming a cacophony of voices that threatened to overwhelm him. Suddenly, a beam of light shot from the clockwork mechanism, striking a point on the wall. The wall shimmered, then dissolved, revealing a vision of the past. Janek gasped. He was looking at Prague as it had been centuries ago, a bustling medieval city filled with knights, merchants, and peasants. Father Elijah laughed, a sound that echoed in the chamber like the tolling of a death knell. "Behold," he cried, "the power of time. We can rewrite history, reshape the present, and control the future." Janek knew he had to stop them. But how? He was just one boy, armed with nothing but a candle and his own courage, facing a fanatical cult and a terrifying clockwork machine. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the shadows. "Stop," he shouted. "What you are doing is madness." Father Elijah turned, his eyes burning with fury. "Who dares to interrupt our sacred ritual?" he hissed. He saw Janek standing in the doorway. A look of recognition flashed across his face. "The street urchin," he sneered. "I should have known you would be the one to interfere." "What are you doing with my neighbors?" Janek yelled. "They're with us, they are blessed now," Father Elijah answered. He turned to the masked figures. "Seize him, he must be silenced." The masked figures moved towards Janek, their clockwork movements betraying no emotion. Janek knew he was in serious trouble. He had to think fast to find a way to escape, to warn the city of the impending danger. He blew out the candle, plunging the chamber into darkness. Then he turned and ran, fleeing into the labyrinthine tunnels of the catacombs, the whispers of the dead urging him onward. Behind him, he could hear the heavy footsteps of the masked figures, their pursuit relentless, their purpose deadly. Chapter 3: The Labyrinth of Bones. Darkness became Janek's ally. He knew the catacombs better than the masked figures, having explored their hidden passages and secret chambers during his daring escapades. He moved through the tunnels with the agility of a rat, weaving between piles of bones, squeezing through narrow crevices, and using the shadows to conceal his movements. The masked figures were relentless in their pursuit. He could hear their heavy footsteps echoing behind him, their breathing ragged and strained. They were stronger than him, more disciplined, but they lacked his familiarity with the catacombs. He came to a fork in the tunnel. One path led deeper into the labyrinth, the other towards what appeared to be a dead end. Janek took the path towards the dead end. He had a plan. He reached the end of the tunnel and pressed himself against the wall. The tunnel terminated in a solid wall of stone, but Janek knew there was a hidden passage behind it. He had discovered it weeks ago, while searching for a place to hide from a particularly zealous city guard. He ran his hand along the wall, searching for the hidden trigger. He found it, a small indentation in the stone, almost invisible to the naked eye. He pressed the indentation, and a section of the wall slid open, revealing a narrow passage. He slipped through the passage and waited, holding his breath. He could hear the masked figures approaching, their footsteps growing louder. They reached the end of the tunnel and stopped, their heavy breathing filling the air. "He must be here," one of the figures said, his voice muffled by the mask. "There is nowhere else to go." "Search the wall," another figure said. "He must have found a hidden passage." Janek held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew they would find the trigger eventually. He had to move fast. He crept through the narrow passage, deeper into the catacombs. The passage opened into a small chamber, filled with rows of sarcophagi. The air was thick with the smell of incense and decay. He heard a noise behind him. The masked figures had found the hidden passage. They were closing in. Janek ran towards the far end of the chamber, searching for another escape route. He spotted a small opening in the ceiling, a narrow shaft that led upwards. He didn't know where it led, but it was his only chance. He climbed onto a sarcophagus and reached for the opening. He managed to get a grip and pulled himself upwards. The shaft was narrow and claustrophobic, the walls slick with moisture. He struggled to climb, his muscles burning, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He heard the masked figures enter the chamber. They shouted at him, urging him to come down. He ignored them and kept climbing. The shaft opened into a small room filled with dust and cobwebs. Janek crawled out of the shaft and stood up, surveying his surroundings. He was in an abandoned crypt, located beneath the church of St. Nicholas. The crypt was filled with the tombs of wealthy merchants and noblemen, their names and deeds etched into the stone. He heard a noise below him. The masked figures were climbing the shaft. They were still after him. Janek ran towards the far end of the crypt, searching for another escape route. He spotted a heavy wooden door, sealed with a rusty lock. He tried to open the door, but it was stuck fast. He heard the masked figures emerge from the shaft. They were closing in. Janek looked around frantically, searching for something to defend himself with. He spotted a heavy iron candlestick on one of the tombs. He grabbed the candlestick and turned to face his pursuers. The masked figures advanced towards him, their movements slow and deliberate. They drew knives from their robes, the blades glinting in the dim light. Janek braced himself for a fight. He knew he was outmatched, but he wouldn't give up without a struggle. He raised the candlestick and swung it at the nearest figure, striking him in the head. The figure staggered backwards, his mask cracking. He reached up and ripped the mask from his face. It was Sister Magdalena. Her eyes were wide with fear and confusion. "Janek," she gasped, "what are you doing here?" "What are you doing here, Sister Magdalena?" Janek retorted. "What has Father Elijah done to you?" Sister Magdalena didn't answer. She lunged at Janek, her knife raised high. Janek dodged her attack and swung the candlestick again, striking her on the arm. She cried out in pain, dropping the knife. She clutched her arm, her face contorted in agony. The other masked figure advanced towards Janek, his knife still raised. Janek knew he couldn't fight them both. He had to escape. He turned and ran towards the wooden door. He raised the candlestick and smashed it against the lock. The lock shattered and the door swung open. Janek stumbled through the door and found himself in a narrow passageway. He ran down the passageway, away from the crypt, away from the masked figures, away from the horrors of the catacombs. He emerged from the passageway into the bustling streets of Prague. The rain had stopped, and the city was alive with activity. People were laughing, talking, and going about their daily lives, oblivious to the dark secrets that lurked beneath their feet. Janek paused, catching his breath. He looked back at the church of St. Nicholas, its imposing facade hiding the entrance to the crypt. He knew he couldn't rest. He had to warn the city about Father Elijah and the Clockwork Cult. He had to find a way to stop them before it was too late. But how? He was just one boy against a powerful and fanatical cult. The odds were stacked against him, but he wouldn't give up. He had to try. He owed it to the city, to the people he cared about. He would expose the cult, even if it was the last thing he did. Chapter 4: Whispers in the Square. Janek melted into the crowd, his mind racing. He needed a plan, and fast. He couldn't go to the city guard. They wouldn't believe a street urchin's wild tale of clockwork cults and time-bending machines. Besides, Father Elijah likely had influence, people in high places who would protect him. He needed proof. He needed to expose the cult's activities to someone who could take action, someone with authority and resources. He thought of old man Arnasht, the senile former clockmaker. Arnasht claimed to have worked on the astronomical clock years ago and spoke of hidden chambers and secret mechanisms within the tower. Everyone dismissed him as a rambling old fool, but Janek had always sensed a spark of truth in his words. Arnasht lived in a small, cluttered apartment above a bakery near the Charles Bridge. Janek made his way through the throng of tourists and locals, his thoughts consumed by the urgency of his mission. He reached the bakery and climbed the narrow staircase to Arnasht's apartment. He knocked on the door, his knuckles rapping against the worn wood. "Who is it?" a frail voice called out. "It's Janek, old man Arnasht," Janek replied. "I need to talk to you." There was a pause, then the sound of shuffling feet. The door creaked open, revealing Arnasht, a hunched figure with a wild mane of white hair and eyes that seemed to peer into another world. "Janek, what brings you here, child?" Arnasht asked, his voice raspy and weak. "It's about the astronomical clock," Janek said, his voice low and urgent. "I think there's something wrong with it." Arnasht's eyes widened. "Wrong? What do you mean, wrong?" Janek quickly recounted his experiences in the catacombs, describing the Clockwork Cult, Father Elijah, and the time-bending machine. Arnasht listened intently, his eyes darting back and forth, his hands trembling. When Janek finished, Arnasht was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I knew it," he said. "I always knew something like this would happen." "You knew?" Janek asked, surprised. "I worked on the clock, boy," Arnasht said. "I saw things, heard things. There are secrets hidden within that tower, secrets that should never be revealed." "Can you help me?" Janek asked. "Can you tell me what the cult is planning?" Arnasht hesitated. "It's dangerous, Janek," he said. "Very dangerous. These people are not to be trifled with." "I know," Janek said, "but I have to try. They're going to rewrite history, Arnasht. They're going to change the world." Arnasht looked at Janek, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. He saw the determination in the boy's face, the unwavering commitment to doing what was right. He sighed. "All right," he said. "I'll help you, but you must promise me, Janek, you must be careful." Arnasht led Janek to a dusty table in the corner of the apartment. He pulled out a tattered blueprint, its lines faded and its edges frayed. "This is a map of the clock tower," Arnasht said. "I made it years ago when I was still working there. It shows all the hidden passages, the secret chambers." Janek studied the blueprint, his eyes scanning the intricate details. Arnasht pointed to a section of the tower, hidden behind the clock face. "There's a secret chamber there," Arnasht said. "It's where the main mechanism is located. The cult must be using it to control the clock." "How do we get in?" Janek asked. Arnasht pointed to a small symbol on the blueprint, a stylized sun with a clock face in the center. "There's a hidden lever behind the sun dial on the clock face," he said. "If you pull it, it will open a secret passage to the chamber." "The sun dial," Janek repeated, his mind racing. "That's how they're getting in and out." But be warned, Janek, Arnosht said. The chamber is guarded. The cult will do anything to protect it. I'll be careful, Janek said. Thank you, Arnosht. Janek left Arnosht's apartment, his mind filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He had a plan, but it was a dangerous one. He was going to break into the astronomical clock and expose the Clockwork Cult. He returned to Old Town Square, his gaze fixed on the clock tower. The square was still crowded with tourists, their faces illuminated by the glow of the gaslights. They were all oblivious to the dark secrets that lurked within the tower, the sinister forces that threatened to rewrite their history. Janek took a deep breath and walked towards the clock tower. He had a feeling he was running out of time. He reached the clock and pretended to be interested, but in reality he scanned the surrounding looking for the right moment to act. He approached the clock face, his eyes searching for the sundial. He spotted it, a small golden disc located above the clock's main dial. He waited for the crowd to thin, then reached out and touched the sundial. He found the hidden lever, a small, almost imperceptible notch in the metal. He pulled the lever, and a section of the clock face slid open, revealing a narrow passage. Janek glanced around to make sure no one had seen him. Then he slipped into the passage, ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. The fate of Prague and perhaps the world rested on his shoulders. Chapter 5: Gears of Deception. The passage was narrow and cramped, barely wide enough for Janek to squeeze through. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old metal. He felt his way along the walls, his fingers tracing the cold, damp stone. The passage sloped downwards, leading him deeper into the heart of the clock tower. He heard the faint sound of gears grinding, growing louder as he descended. He knew he was getting closer to the secret chamber. He also knew that the cult would be waiting for him. He reached the end of the passage and found himself in a small antechamber. The chamber was dimly lit by a single lantern, casting long, eerie shadows. In the center of the chamber stood a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands. Janek approached the door cautiously, listening for any sounds from within. He heard nothing but the steady grinding of gears. He took a deep breath and pushed open the door. He stepped into the secret chamber. The chamber was vast and cavernous, filled with a bewildering array of clockwork mechanisms. Gears of all sizes spun and whirred, their movements synchronized in a complex and mesmerizing dance. Wires and tubes snaked across the floor, connecting the mechanisms to a central control panel. In the center of the chamber stood the time-bending machine, a grotesque parody of the astronomical clock. It was even larger and more intricate than Janek had imagined, a chaotic jumble of gears, cogs, and springs. A strange, pulsating energy emanated from the machine, filling the chamber with an unsettling hum. Father Elijah stood before the machine, his back to Janek. He was surrounded by the masked figures who were chanting in a low, rhythmic tone. "You should not be here, boy," Father Elijah said, his voice calm and measured. He did not turn around. "This is a sacred place, a place of power. You do not belong here." "What are you doing, Father Elijah?" Janek asked, his voice trembling slightly. "What are you trying to do?" I am trying to save the world, Janek, Father Elijah said. I am trying to create a better future for all of us. By rewriting history, Janek asked. By controlling time. Time is a river, Janek, Father Elijah said. It flows in one direction, carrying us all towards our inevitable demise. But what if we could change the course of that river? What if we could steer it towards a brighter future? You can't control time, Father Elijah, Janek said. It's too powerful, it will destroy you. Father Elijah laughed. I am not afraid of time, Janek, he said. I will master it, I will bend it to my will. He turned around, his eyes burning with fanatical zeal. Join me, Janek, he said. Together we can create a new world, a world free from suffering and injustice. I will never join you, Janek said, his voice filled with defiance. What you are doing is wrong, it's evil. Father Elijah sighed. I had hoped you would see things my way, Janek, he said, but I see that you are too stubborn, too naive. He gestured to the masked figures. Seize him, he said. He is a threat to our mission. The masked figures advanced towards Janek, their movements slow and deliberate. Janek knew he was outnumbered, outmatched, but he wouldn't give up without a fight. He looked around the chamber, searching for anything he could use as a weapon. He spotted a wrench lying on a nearby workbench. He grabbed the wrench and turned to face his pursuers. The masked figures lunged at him, their hands outstretched. Janek swung the wrench, striking one of the figures on the arm. The figure cried out in pain, stumbling backwards. Janek swung the wrench again, striking another figure on the leg. The figure collapsed to the floor, clutching his leg in agony. The remaining figures hesitated, their movements uncertain. They had underestimated Janek. They thought he was just a street urchin, but he was proving to be a formidable opponent. Janek seized the opportunity. He charged towards Father Elijah, his wrench raised high. Father Elijah stepped back, his eyes widening in alarm. He didn't expect Janek to attack him. He was a frail old man, not used to physical confrontation. Janek swung the wrench, aiming for Father Elijah's head. But before the wrench could connect, Sister Magdalena stepped in front of Father Elijah, shielding him with her body. The wrench struck Sister Magdalena on the side of the head. She crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Janek stared at Sister Magdalena, his eyes filled with horror. He hadn't meant to hurt her. He only wanted to stop Father Elijah. Father Elijah looked down at Sister Magdalena, his face etched with grief. "You fool," he said to Janek, his voice filled with rage. "You have doomed us all." He raised his hand and pointed it at Janek. "Destroy him," he commanded. The masked figures surged forward, their faces contorted with anger. Janek knew he was in serious trouble. He had to escape, to warn the city about Father Elijah and the Clockwork Cult. He turned and ran, dodging the masked figures, weaving through the clockwork mechanisms. He reached the door and fled into the antechamber, slamming the door behind him. He raced back through the passage, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the masked figures pursuing him, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. He reached the end of the passage and burst out onto the clock face. He looked around, desperate for a way to escape. He saw the crowd gathered below, oblivious to the danger. He knew what he had to do. He had to expose the cult's activities to the people, to warn them about the impending threat. He climbed onto the edge of the clock face, his body silhouetted against the night sky. He took a deep breath and shouted, his voice ringing out across Old Town Square. "People of Prague, beware the Clockwork Cult. They are trying to control time. They will destroy us all." Chapter 6. The Clockwork City Awakens. Janek's cry echoed through Old Town Square, momentarily silencing the chatter of tourists and the clatter of horse-drawn carriages. All eyes turned upwards, focusing on the figure perched precariously on the astronomical clock. He could see their faces, a mixture of confusion, curiosity, and disbelief. "He's mad," someone shouted from the crowd. "Ignore him," another voice yelled. "He's just trying to cause trouble." But Janek didn't care what they thought. He had to get his message across, to make them understand the danger they were in. "The Clockwork Cult is real," he cried, his voice hoarse from shouting. "They're inside the clock tower trying to rewrite history. You have to stop them." He gestured towards the clock tower, his arm trembling with exertion. "They're using a machine to control time. They'll change everything you know." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people were starting to listen, their faces etched with concern. Others remained skeptical, dismissing Janek as a lunatic. Suddenly, the door to the clock tower burst open, and the masked figures emerged, their movements frantic. They spotted Janek on the clock face and shouted at him, urging him to come down. "Silence him," one of the figures yelled. "He knows too much." The figures began to climb the clock tower, their movements clumsy and awkward. They were not used to climbing, their bodies more suited to the dark chambers beneath the city. Janek knew he couldn't stay there. The figures were closing in, and he had nowhere to run. He had to get down, to rally the people, to convince them to fight. He climbed down the clock face, his movements quick and agile. He reached the ground and plunged into the crowd, pushing his way through the throng of onlookers. "Help me," he cried. "They're coming, we have to stop them." Some people stepped aside, their faces filled with fear. Others stood their ground, blocking his path. "Get out of the way, boy," one man shouted. "You're causing a disturbance." Janek pushed past him, his determination unwavering. He had to find someone who would believe him, someone who would take action. He spotted a familiar face in the crowd. It was a city guard, a stern-looking man with a thick mustache and a watchful eye. Janek had seen him patrolling the square many times before. He ran towards the guard, his heart pounding in his chest. "Officer," he cried, "you have to help me. There's a cult inside the clock tower. They're trying to control time." The guard looked at Janek, his expression skeptical. "What are you talking about, boy?" he asked. "There's no cult inside the clock tower." "Yes, there is," Janek insisted. "I saw them. They have a machine that can rewrite history. You have to believe me." The guard sighed. "I've had enough of your nonsense," he said. "I'm taking you into custody for disturbing the peace." He reached out to grab Janek, but Janek dodged his grasp. He knew he couldn't afford to be arrested. He had to convince the guard to make him understand the urgency of the situation. "Please, officer," he pleaded, "you have to listen to me. Father Elijah is the leader of the cult. He's a dangerous man." The guard hesitated, his expression softening slightly. He had heard rumors about Father Elijah, whispers of strange activities and secret meetings. He had dismissed them as idle gossip, but Janek's frantic words were starting to sow seeds of doubt in his mind. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the crowd, pushing his way towards them. It was Father Elijah, his face contorted with rage. "There he is," Janek cried, pointing at Father Elijah. "He's the leader of the Clockwork Cult." Father Elijah stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening in alarm. He hadn't expected Janek to expose him so publicly. "Seize him," Father Elijah commanded, pointing at Janek. "He's a liar. He's trying to discredit me." The masked figures surged forward, their movements swift and coordinated. They surrounded Janek, cutting off his escape. The guard drew his sword, his expression hardening. He had seen enough. He knew that something was terribly wrong. "Stand down," he commanded, his voice ringing out across the square. "I am placing you all under arrest." The masked figures ignored him, their eyes fixed on Janek. They lunged at him, their hands outstretched. The guard stepped forward, his sword flashing in the gaslight. He slashed at the figures, forcing them back. A fight erupted in the square, a chaotic melee of swords, fists, and terrified screams. The crowd scattered, seeking refuge from the violence. Janek watched in horror as the guard fought bravely against the masked figures. He knew that the guard was outmatched, outnumbered. He had to do something to help. He looked around, searching for a weapon. He spotted a cobblestone lying on the ground. He picked it up and hurled it at one of the figures, striking him on the head. The figure staggered backwards, his mask cracking. He fell to the ground, unconscious. Janek grabbed another cobblestone and hurled it at another figure, striking him on the leg. The figure cried out in pain, collapsing to the ground. The remaining figures hesitated, their movements faltering. They were losing the fight. Suddenly, a piercing whistle sounded from the clock tower. It was a signal, a call to arms. From the shadows of the buildings surrounding the square, more figures emerged, their faces hidden by masks. They were members of the Clockwork Cult, summoned to defend their leader. The fight intensified, the square transformed into a battleground. The guard fought valiantly, but he was overwhelmed by the sheer number of cultists. Janek knew that they were losing. The cult was too strong, too organized. They had to find a way to stop them, to destroy the time-bending machine. He looked at the clock tower, its intricate mechanisms churning, its gears grinding. He knew that the machine was the key to the cult's power. If they could destroy it, they could stop them. He made a decision. He was going to climb the clock tower to reach the secret chamber to destroy the machine. He turned to the guard, who was now surrounded by cultists, his sword stained with blood. "I'm going to the clock tower," Janek shouted. "I'm going to destroy the machine." The guard looked at Janek, his face etched with pain and exhaustion. He nodded weakly, his eyes filled with gratitude. Janek turned and ran towards the clock tower, dodging the fighting cultists, weaving through the chaos. He reached the entrance and slipped inside, disappearing into the darkness. He was alone again, facing the unknown, but he was determined to succeed. He had to save Prague, to save the world. He would destroy the time-bending machine, even if it cost him his life. Chapter 7: The Heart of the Machine. The passage within the clock tower was even darker and more treacherous than Janek remembered. The sounds of the battle in the square faded behind him, replaced by the rhythmic grinding of gears and the echoing tick-tock of the clock's mechanisms. He felt his way along the walls, his hands brushing against cold stone and rough-hewn timber. He knew he was being pursued. He could hear the muffled footsteps of the cultists behind him, their pursuit relentless. They were determined to stop him from reaching the machine. He reached the antechamber, the small room before the secret chamber. He paused, listening for any sounds from within. He heard nothing but the steady hum of the time-bending machine. He took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The secret chamber was even more chaotic than before. The gears were spinning faster, the wires were sparking, and the air was thick with a strange, metallic smell. The machine was operating at full capacity, its power surging. Father Elijah stood before the machine, his eyes glazed over, his body trembling. He was chanting in a low, guttural tone, his voice filled with a strange, unnatural energy. The masked figures were gone. They had all gone to defend Father Elijah in the square, leaving him alone with the machine. "You cannot stop me, Janek," Father Elijah said, his voice echoing in the chamber. "I am too close to achieving my goal." "What are you doing, Father Elijah?" Janek asked, his voice trembling slightly. "What are you trying to change?" "I am trying to erase the suffering, the pain, the injustice," Father Elijah said. "I am trying to create a perfect world, a world free from sin." "You can't do that, Father Elijah," Janek said. "You can't erase the past, it's part of who we are." "The past is a burden, Janek," Father Elijah said. "It holds us back, prevents us from reaching our full potential. I will cast off that burden and we will all be free." He turned to face Janek, his eyes burning with fanatical zeal. "Join me, Janek," he said. "Together we can create a new world, a world of eternal peace and happiness." "I will never join you," Janek said, his voice filled with defiance. "What you are doing is madness. It's destroying everything." Father Elijah sighed. "I had hoped you would understand," he said, "but I see that you are beyond saving." He raised his hand and pointed it at Janek. "The machine will decide your fate," he said. He turned back to the machine and resumed his chanting, his voice growing louder and more intense. The machine began to vibrate violently, its gears spinning out of control. Janek knew he had to act fast. He had to destroy the machine before it was too late. He looked around the chamber, searching for a way to disable the machine. He spotted a large lever on the side of the control panel. He didn't know what it did, but he knew he had to try something. He ran towards the control panel, dodging the sparking wires and the spinning gears. He reached the lever and grabbed it with both hands. "No," Father Elijah cried, his voice filled with panic. "Don't touch that lever." Janek ignored him, and pulled the lever with all his might. The machine shuddered, its gears grinding to a halt. The lights flickered and died, plunging the chamber into darkness. A deafening silence descended upon the chamber, broken only by the sound of Janek's heavy breathing. He had done it. He had disabled the machine. Suddenly, a surge of energy erupted from the machine, engulfing Janek in a blinding light. He felt a searing pain coursing through his body, as if every cell was being ripped apart. He cried out in agony, collapsing to the floor. He felt his consciousness fading, his mind slipping into darkness. He heard a voice in his head, a voice that was both familiar and alien. It was the voice of the machine, the voice of time itself. "You cannot stop me," the voice said. "Time is eternal, it cannot be destroyed." Janek struggled to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "But I disabled the machine." "The machine was merely a tool," the voice said. "The power resides within me, within time itself." What are you going to do?" Janek asked, his voice fading. "I am going to correct the imbalance," the voice said. "You have disrupted the flow of time. I must restore the balance." Janek felt his body being pulled apart, his essence dissolving into nothingness. He was dying. Suddenly, he felt a surge of energy coursing through him, a force that was both alien and strangely comforting. He felt his body being reassembled, his essence being restored. He opened his eyes and looked around. He was still in the secret chamber, lying on the floor, but something was different. The chamber was no longer chaotic and disordered. The gears were spinning smoothly, the wires were neatly arranged, and the air was clean and fresh. The machine was no longer a grotesque parody of the astronomical clock. It was a beautiful, elegant piece of machinery, humming with a gentle, harmonious energy. Father Elijah was gone. The masked figures were gone. Janek was alone. He stood up, his body feeling stronger and more vibrant than ever before. He felt a sense of peace and understanding that he had never experienced before. He knew what he had to do. He had to learn to control the machine, to use its power for good. He had to become the guardian of time, the protector of history. He walked towards the control panel and placed his hand on the lever. He felt a surge of energy coursing through his body, a connection to the machine, to time itself. He closed his eyes and focused his mind, willing the machine to respond. He felt the gears turning, the wires humming, the power surging. He opened his eyes and looked at the machine. It was responding to his will, obeying his commands. He smiled. He was ready. He was the master of time. He just had to make a plan for himself. Chapter 8: The Guardian of Time. The first few weeks were a blur of experimentation and discovery. Janek learned the intricacies of the time-bending machine, its capabilities and its limitations. He discovered that it could not simply rewrite history, as Father Elijah had intended. Instead, it could create localized temporal distortions, allowing him to observe past events, accelerate or decelerate time within a limited area, and even glimpse possible futures. The power was immense, terrifying, and intoxicating. He understood the temptation that had driven Father Elijah to madness. The desire to fix the world, to erase suffering, was a powerful force. But Janek also saw the danger. Tampering with time, even with the best intentions, could have unforeseen and catastrophic consequences. He vowed to use the machine responsibly, to protect the timeline from those who would seek to exploit it for their own selfish purposes. He became the guardian of time, a silent protector watching over Prague, ensuring the delicate balance of the past, present, and future. He spent hours in the secret chamber, studying historical texts, poring over astronomical charts, and experimenting with the machine's capabilities. He learned about the great events of Prague's past, the triumphs and tragedies that had shaped the city's identity. He saw the rise and fall of empires, the struggles for freedom and justice, the enduring spirit of the Czech people. He also saw the potential dangers that lay ahead. He glimpsed possible futures, timelines where Prague was consumed by war, plague, or tyranny. He knew he had to be vigilant, to be ready to intervene if necessary to prevent those futures from coming to pass. One evening, as he was studying the machine, he sensed a disturbance in the temporal flow. A ripple in time, a distortion in the fabric of reality. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but Janek knew something was amiss. He focused his mind, using the machine to amplify his senses. He saw a vision, a fleeting glimpse of a figure cloaked in shadows, tampering with the timeline. The figure was attempting to alter a key event in Prague's history, an event that could have devastating consequences for the present. Janek knew he had to act. He had to stop the figure from changing the past. He activated the machine, focusing its energy on the point in time where the disturbance was occurring. He created a temporal portal, a gateway through time that would allow him to travel to the past. He hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never used the machine to travel through time before. It was a dangerous undertaking, fraught with peril, but he had no choice. He had to protect the timeline. He stepped into the portal, his body dissolving into a stream of energy. He felt himself being pulled through time, hurtling backwards towards the past. He arrived in Prague centuries ago, during the reign of Emperor Charles IV. The city was bustling with activity, its streets filled with merchants, craftsmen, and scholars. The Charles Bridge was newly constructed, its stone gleaming in the sunlight. Janek found himself in the midst of a historical event, the laying of the foundation stone for St. Vitus Cathedral. Charles IV himself was present, along with a throng of dignitaries and onlookers. He scanned the crowd, searching for the figure he had seen in his vision. He spotted him standing near the emperor, cloaked in shadows, his face hidden by a hood. Janek knew he had to stop him, but he couldn't simply attack him in front of the emperor and his court. He had to be subtle, to be discreet. He approached the figure, his hand resting on the hilt of a hidden knife. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." The figure turned, his eyes glinting in the shadows of his hood. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice cold and hard. "I know what you're planning," Janek said. "I know you're trying to change the past." The figure smirked. "And what if I am?" he asked. "What can you do to stop me?" Janek drew his knife, his eyes locking onto the figure. "I can do this," he said. He lunged at the figure, his knife aimed at his heart. The figure dodged his attack, his movements surprisingly quick and agile. He drew a dagger of his own, its blade shimmering in the sunlight. A fight ensued, a desperate struggle for control of the past. Janek fought with all his skill and strength, but the figure was a formidable opponent. He was skilled in the art of combat, his movements precise and deadly. Janek managed to disarm the figure, knocking his dagger to the ground. But the figure retaliated, striking Janek in the face with his fist. Janek stumbled backwards, his nose bleeding, his vision blurred. The figure seized the opportunity and grabbed Janek by the throat, squeezing tightly. Janek struggled to breathe, his lungs burning, his vision darkening. He knew he was dying. Suddenly, he felt a surge of energy coursing through him, a force that was both alien and strangely comforting. He felt his body being strengthened, his senses being sharpened. He kicked the figure in the groin, sending him sprawling to the ground. He stood up, gasping for air, his body trembling. The figure lay on the ground, writhing in pain. Janek approached him, his knife raised high. "Who are you?" Janek demanded. "Who sent you?" The figure looked up at Janek, his eyes filled with hatred. "I will never tell you," he said. Janek hesitated. He didn't want to kill him, but he had no choice. He had to protect the timeline. He raised his knife and plunged it into the figure's heart. The figure gasped, his body convulsing. He died instantly. Janek stood over the body, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had done it. He had saved the past. He looked around at the crowd who were staring at him in shock and horror. He knew he couldn't stay there. He had to get back to the present. He activated the machine, creating another temporal portal. He stepped into the portal, his body dissolving into a stream of energy. He felt himself being pulled through time, hurtling forwards towards the present. He arrived back in the secret chamber, his body aching, his mind exhausted. He had succeeded in his mission, but he knew that this was just the beginning. There would be other threats, other dangers. He had to be ready. He was the guardian of time, and he would protect the timeline at all costs. Chapter 9: Echoes of Tomorrow. The incident in the past left Janek shaken but resolute. He realized that the Clockwork Cult's influence, or perhaps something even more sinister, extended far beyond Prague. The figure he had killed was just a pawn, a tool in a larger game. Someone, somewhere, was actively trying to manipulate the timeline, and Janek was the only one standing in their way. He intensified his surveillance of Prague, using the time-bending machine to scan for temporal anomalies, subtle shifts in the fabric of reality. He learned to recognize the telltale signs of tampering, echoes of future events bleeding into the present, phantom images of alternate timelines, and the unsettling feeling of déjà vu that lingered long after it should have faded. He also began to research the history of time manipulation, delving into ancient texts, alchemical treatises, and forgotten folklore. He discovered that the concept of controlling time had fascinated humanity for centuries, inspiring countless myths, legends, and experiments. He learned about lost civilizations that had supposedly mastered the art of temporal mechanics, only to be destroyed by their own hubris. The more he learned, the more he realized the immensity of the responsibility he had taken on. He was not just protecting Prague, he was protecting the very foundation of reality. One cold November evening, as the first snow of winter began to fall on Prague, Janik detected a powerful temporal surge emanating from the Jewish quarter. The surge was unlike anything he had encountered before, a chaotic wave of energy that threatened to destabilize the entire timeline. He focused the machine, attempting to pinpoint the source of the surge. He saw a vision, a horrifying glimpse of the future. Prague engulfed in flames, its buildings crumbling, its streets littered with corpses. The city was being ravaged by a temporal storm, a chaotic vortex of time that was tearing reality apart. Janik knew he had to act immediately. He activated the machine and created a temporal portal, setting the destination to the heart of the Jewish quarter. He stepped through the portal, his heart pounding in his chest. He arrived in a narrow alleyway, the air thick with the smell of ozone and decay. The snow was falling heavily, blanketing the streets in a layer of white. He could hear the faint sound of chanting growing louder with each step. He followed the sound of the chanting, his senses on high alert. He reached a small, dilapidated synagogue, its windows boarded up and its entrance sealed with iron bars. The chanting was coming from within. Janik knew that this was the source of the temporal surge. He had to find a way inside. He circled the synagogue, searching for an opening. He spotted a small window high above the entrance, its glass shattered. It was too high to reach, but he might be able to climb. He found a stack of wooden crates nearby and piled them up beneath the window. He climbed onto the crates, his fingers reaching for the window ledge. He managed to get a grip and pulled himself upwards. He squeezed through the broken window, landing inside the synagogue with a thud. He found himself in a darkened sanctuary, its walls lined with ancient scrolls and religious artifacts. In the center of the sanctuary, a group of figures was gathered around a makeshift altar. They were dressed in black robes, their faces hidden by masks. They were chanting in a strange, guttural language, their voices rising in a crescendo of religious fervor. At the head of the altar stood a figure that Janik recognized immediately, alchemist Victor, the disgraced alchemist who had sought redemption by harnessing the clock tower's power. He thought that someone had taken him away to some kind of asylum. He was still alive. Victor was holding a strange device, a complex contraption made of brass, copper, and glass. The device was pulsing with a chaotic energy, its wires sparking, its gears grinding. It was a miniature version of the time-bending machine, a crude attempt to replicate its power. Janik realized that Victor was trying to open a temporal rift, a gateway to another time. He was trying to summon something from the past, something that could destroy Prague. "Stop!" Janik shouted, his voice ringing out in the sanctuary. "What are you doing?" Victor turned, his eyes widening in alarm. "You," he hissed. "How did you find me?" "I know what you're planning, Victor," Janik said. "You're trying to destroy Prague." I am trying to save Prague, Victor said. I am trying to cleanse it of its sin. You're insane, Janek said. You can't control time, it will destroy you. I am not afraid of time, Victor said. I will bend it to my will. He raised the device above his head and resumed his chanting, his voice growing louder and more intense. The device began to glow with a blinding light, its energy surging. Janek knew he had to stop him. He charged towards Victor, his fist clenched. Victor unleashed a wave of energy from the device, striking Janek in the chest. Janek was thrown backwards, his body slamming against a wall. He lay on the floor, gasping for air, his body aching. He felt his powers fading, his connection to the machine weakening. Victor laughed, his voice filled with triumph. You cannot stop me, guardian of time, he said. I am too powerful. He turned back to the altar and resumed his chanting, preparing to open the temporal rift. Janek struggled to his feet, his determination unwavering. He had to find a way to stop Victor, even if it cost him his life. He looked around the sanctuary, searching for a weapon. He spotted a heavy candelabrum on the altar. He grabbed the candelabrum and charged towards Victor, swinging it with all his might. The candelabrum struck Victor on the head, sending him sprawling to the ground. The device flew from his hands, crashing against the floor. The device shattered, releasing a chaotic surge of energy that engulfed the sanctuary. The walls began to tremble, the floor began to crack, and the air began to shimmer. A temporal rift opened in the center of the sanctuary, a swirling vortex of light and darkness. Something was coming through. Janek stared at the rift, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what was about to emerge, but he knew it would be something terrible. The figure of the chronophage was getting closer. The chronophage, he knew, was a parasitic creature that feeds on temporal energy, leaving behind decaying husks of time. It was a horror he hoped to never see. But here it was, getting closer and closer. The future of Prague hung in the balance. Chapter 10: The Devourer of Time. The temporal rift pulsed, spitting forth a creature unlike anything Janek had ever encountered, even in his darkest visions of possible futures. It was a chronophage, a being of pure temporal entropy, its form shifting and dissolving like smoke in the wind. Fragments of different eras clung to it: a Roman legionary's helmet, a medieval peasant's cloak, a scrap of fabric from a future spacesuit, all decaying and crumbling before his eyes. The air around it crackled with a bone-chilling cold, a tangible representation of the void it carried within. Victor, still dazed from the blow, stared up at the chronophage with a mixture of awe and terror. I have summoned you," he stammered, his voice trembling. "Cleanse this city." The chronophage turned its attention to Victor. It possessed no eyes, no discernible features, yet Janek felt its gaze like a physical weight. A wave of temporal decay washed over Victor. He aged rapidly, his skin wrinkling, his hair turning white, his body collapsing in on itself. Within seconds, he was nothing more than a pile of dust and tattered robes. The chronophage had claimed its first victim. Now it turned its attention to Janek. The very air seemed to thin, the colors to fade. He could feel his memories blurring, the edges of his identity dissolving. The chronophage was not just a monster, it was a force of annihilation, capable of erasing existence itself. He had to act, and quickly. He focused his mind, reaching out to the time-bending machine for guidance. He needed a solution, a way to banish the chronophage back to the void from whence it came. But the connection was weak, strained by the temporal chaos swirling around him. He remembered something old man Arnosht had told him, a half-forgotten story about a ritual to ward off evil spirits. The ritual involved a specific sequence of chimes, played on the bells of the astronomical clock. The chimes, Arnosht claimed, resonated with a hidden harmonic frequency, a frequency that could disrupt the flow of temporal energy. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but Janek had nothing left to lose. He closed his eyes, visualizing the sequence of chimes in his mind. He had heard them countless times, the familiar melody a comforting presence in the heart of Prague. But this time, he needed to hear them with a new clarity, to understand their underlying structure. He reached out to the shattered remains of Victor's device, scavenging for any remaining components that could amplify his will. He found a piece of quartz crystal, still humming with a faint energy. He clutched it in his hand, focusing his mind, channeling his power through the crystal. He opened his eyes and began to chant, his voice echoing in the sanctuary. He didn't know the words, didn't understand their meaning, but he knew the rhythm, the cadence, the precise sequence of sounds that would trigger the harmonic resonance. As he chanted, the broken shards of glass around the sanctuary began to vibrate. The ancient scrolls fluttered, their parchment pages whispering secrets from the past. The chronophage paused, its attention drawn to Janek's voice. He continued to chant, his voice growing louder, more insistent. He could feel the power building within him, the temporal energy responding to his will. He was no longer just a boy, he was a conduit, a channel for the forces of time itself. Suddenly, the bells of the astronomical clock began to chime. The chimes were not the usual hourly sequence. They were the sequence that Janek was chanting, the sequence that Arnosht had described, the sequence that resonated with the hidden harmonic frequency. Someone somewhere was listening. Someone was helping him. The bells chimed louder and louder, their sound reverberating through the city, washing over the sanctuary. The chronophage recoiled, its form flickering and distorting. It was being forced back, banished by the power of the chimes. Janek continued to chant, his voice reaching a crescendo. He could feel the chronophage weakening, its connection to this reality dissolving. The temporal rift began to shrink, its swirling vortex collapsing in on itself. With a final, agonizing shriek, the chronophage was pulled back into the rift. The rift sealed shut, leaving behind only a lingering scent of ozone and decay. Silence descended upon the sanctuary. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the streets of Prague in a layer of white. Janek stood in the center of the sanctuary, his body trembling, his mind exhausted. He had done it. He had saved Prague. But he knew that this was not the end. There would be other threats, other dangers. The forces that sought to manipulate time were still out there, lurking in the shadows. He was the guardian of time, and he would continue to protect the timeline, no matter the cost. He had a city to protect after all. He walked out of the synagogue into the snow-covered streets of Prague. He looked up at the astronomical clock, its bells silent, its gears turning. He knew that he was not alone. He had allies, friends, people who believed in him. He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs. He was ready for whatever the future held. He was the guardian of time, and Prague was his city. The end.